Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Amy the Cat Lady, and we are back with the Immortality and Fallout series as part of the overall Science of Fallout series. And today we're going to start talking about ghouls. I'm probably going to do this over 2 videos just because there is a lot to talk about. There's a lot of interesting aspects to the ghouls that have been ever present in the wasteland since the very beginning. So first I thought we'd talk about a couple of definitions for the words that are kind of used in this context. So looking up some specific definitions. So first of all, the word ghoul is generally defined as an evil spirit that robs graves and eats bodies. And this comes from sort of Muslim legends. So it comes from legends out of the kind of Middle East and various places, and the word ghoul actually does come from Arabic, and it is a term that's often used to describe people that have an unnatural interest in death and dead bodies, grave robbers, and malevolent spirits. So it is something that somebody that's ghoulish is somebody that is really into kind of, interested in morbid things, or somebody that goes and steals dead bodies out of graves, things like that. So that's where the term comes from. So the term itself is generally something that is, used to define something that's evil or something that's, horrible and disgusting and that kind of thing. So it's definitely not a complimentary word to use towards somebody. And some people do throw the term zombie around as well when it comes to the ghouls in Fallout, because they look like zombies. There's no, sugarcoating that fact, really. So zombies are kind of generally portrayed as kind of walking corpses. So they're dead, but they've been reanimated and they're walking around. Generally, they are mindless, they're unaware of things, they have lost all kind of higher brain functions and ability to think and reason, taking on a more kind of mindless, animalistic sort of pattern of behaviour, looking to eat people, biting people to pass the zombie condition on. In fiction, zombies generally it's caused by some kind of virus or some kind of disease outbreak or something. But the term again originates from voodoo practices from various parts of the world, and it's often associated with a snake deity as well. But that's something that is kind of derived from voodoo practices, which are kind of religious practices from Africa, South America, and various parts of the world. And then the next definition is a mutant. So if you've played Fallout, you know what a mutant is. So a mutant's obviously a living thing that's been physically changed from others of the same species due to changes in its genetics. So a genetic mutation that causes a physical difference. Can happen to plants, it can happen to insects, animals, fish, birds, the whole spectrum, anything that's definitively alive, it kind of applies to them. And then the final definition is feral. So when we talk about ghouls, you have ghouls and then you have feral ghouls. The ghouls are still act and think like humans. The feral ghouls have become mindless zombies essentially, so that's where the kind of zombie term tends to come from, because of the behaviour you see with the feral ghouls, which makes sense. So feral is defined as something that is wild, fierce and uncontrolled. So particularly it's used for animals that humans have domesticated that are living in the wild and don't lose that fear of humans that most animals have. So cats, for example, are a very, very common animal that you find the term feral used for. So cats can survive actually perfectly well out in the wild. So domestic cats that have, escaped or got lost and then they've bred, so that you have this colony of wild cats that are a domestic cat, but they're living wild and they tend to not be very trustful of humans. It is a problem, particularly in the UK, because that has contributed quite a lot to the loss of the Scottish wild cats, because they've been interbreeding with domestic feral cats and things. So that's where the word feral comes from, and that's what it means. So we need to look at the ghouls that we find in Fallout. So Fallout's ghouls are mutated humans, so there's a few kind of distinctive features, particularly visible features. So we have loss and damage to the skin, to the hair, and to the cartilage. So there's exposed muscle tissue for a lot of them. Most of them have lost at least the majority of their hair, and they tend to lose their nose and sometimes their external ears as well. Because remember, the structure of your nose and your ears is all cartilage, there's not as much bone in it. So they can lose that because the radiation has damaged the cartilage. They do have immunity to radiation and also can be healed by radiation. So if they're exposed to it, it can actually heal damage and improves their regenerative abilities as well, which they do seem to have, that they can regenerate and heal surprisingly well. They have an extremely prolonged lifespan. A lot of the ghouls that you do see in the Fallout games were alive before the bombs fell. So, we're talking 200 plus years potentially. But with that, there is that potential for cognitive decline, which is what gives you the feral ghouls, which we'll talk about a wee bit more later on. But feralization can happen immediately when the person becomes a ghoul, or it can be a more gradual onset, like you see with dementia, essentially. So ghouls do still need to eat and drink, but they can drink irradiated water without any issue, and they can eat things that humans can't, wouldn't, or shouldn't eat, including humans. And they do have resistance to common diseases and also seem to be quite resistant to chems. I believe that was the reason that Ultrajet was invented, because normal jet wasn't really that effective in ghouls. So there was a ghoul who decided to invent Ultrajet that would actually have some effect on them. So that's kind of an interesting one as well. And a lot of them do have changes to their voice, probably due to damage to the vocal cords and the larynx. So we know that radiation damages the skin and the kind of mucous membranes and things, and it also damages the cartilage. So larynx is mainly held together. It's all made up structurally with cartilage, and the vocal cords are also supported by that cartilage. So if there's damage to that, that would explain why a lot of them have these kind of gravelly, rough voices, although there are a few that seem to have actually retained a fairly normal sounding voice. But that would be the explanation for that, similar to how they've lost their noses, which also could have an impact on how their voice sounds as well. But it's probably a case that the cartilage that holds the larynx together and the supporting structures around the vocal cords are affected. They are also vulnerable to necrosis, which is the proper medical term for rotten tissue, essentially. They also seem to be prone to getting arthritis, so joint changes, and also changes to the eye, cataracts and glaucoma. So cataracts is a change in the actual lens inside the eye, where it becomes not see-through anymore. That can happen quite gradually, and it does eventually cause loss of vision. Glaucoma is a condition where there's increased intraocular pressure, which is pressure within the eyeball. That, if that builds up, can be very painful, and it can also cause damage to the retina and affect vision, and even lead to blindness as well if it's not treated and addressed. So that is something that they are, and that could explain why a lot of the feral ghouls that you see, they don't seem to be that perceptive in the dark. They don't seem to see very well in the dark, so they're more likely to detect you if you make noise than just by seeing you. So that kind of fits actually with the behaviour that you see in the feral ghouls especially. So let's talk a wee bit about feralization. So this is a process where ghouls go from being compos mentis and aware and able to think and talk and be aware of what's going on around them, and they become mindless animals, and they are just really out to look for food, and they'll attack anything in sight that's not a ghoul. So what happens is that the brain function is damaged, so there's degeneration, which means kind of gradual breakdown and destruction of the brain, which damages these higher mental functions. So particularly the cerebrum, where a lot of our kind of memory and thought and reasoning and sensory input and everything goes into the cerebrum. So that's what seems to be damaged. And as I mentioned, it can happen very suddenly. So a lot of people were turned into feral ghouls pretty much immediately when the bombs fell. But for others, it seems to be something that they gradually develop with age or with increased exposure to the radiation, that it causes damage to these parts of the brain, but it doesn't damage the more primitive function of the brain, which is the bits that cover your heart and lung function, the bits that cover basic survival instincts, what's called the more primal parts. So that's your brainstem, which regulates your autonomic nervous system for your heart rate, blood pressure, and lung function and things. The amygdala, which is involved in basic kind of fight or flight responses. So again, very, very primal instincts. And the hypothalamus, that's also part of that process of the what's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, that produces adrenaline and is involved in regulating all that part of things. So that's why they have this behaviour, but you can't really talk to them, you can't really reason with them, and they are just kind of mindless zombies, unfortunately. And there are sort of possible causes for feralisation. It does seem that social isolation can be a factor for some of them. So a good example actually is there's the little kind of hut with the basement just down the road from Sanctuary, which I'll show you here, and you go in and there's a feral ghoul in the basement locked away with a mini nuke that he's taken apart. And it's because they built something on his land he wasn't happy about, so he was going to destroy it using a mini nuke, but then he ended up becoming a feral ghoul and he was kind of locked in there, so that probably was the reason that he became feral. He was sitting in a radioactive basement for a long time, so we don't know how quickly he actually turned. A poor mental state does seem to increase the risk, so people that have become really distressed and traumatised by everything seem more likely to then go to being feral. It could be because of activation of that autonomic nervous system that we talked about. So the HPA axis is active, so there's adrenaline from stress or cortisol from chronic stress, and it could be that those hormones increase the chance of something changing and them becoming feral, whereas individuals that are highly motivated, for whatever reason, they're determined to do something, they're determined to find somebody, it seems that they are less at risk, although the risk isn't completely eliminated. A good example is the ghoul in the TV show, played absolutely masterfully by Walton Goggins, I have to say. We know that he's kind of starting to become potentially feral, that he's having to use that drug, which we will talk about just in a second. But he has a strong motivation because he demanded to know where his family was. He wants to know where his wife is. He wants to know where his daughter is. And he's very, very motivated to kind of pursue that. So if an individual becomes a ghoul and they have a reason to keep looking or to keep fighting or whatever the reason is, then they will potentially be less at risk. The next possible cause is extensive radiation exposure can eventually lead to it. So while the ghouls are immune to radiation, if they are continuing to expose themselves by hanging around the glowing sea or, spraying radioactive water everywhere like they do in Kiddy Kingdom and Nuka World, or hanging about at the glow, that they are more likely to become feral because the radiation can still damage their brain and lead to this process happening. And there could also be some individual genetic factors as well that, there seems to be a factor, but the reason that some people become ghouls versus just die from radiation. So it could be that there's genetic factors that can make somebody maybe more or less likely to become feral as well. And in terms of prevention, other than avoiding excessive radiation exposure, there is potential progress that someone has managed to invent a drug that at least delays the process of fertilisation. It's not a cure, because we do see from the TV show that the ghoul needs to take it regularly or he risks going down that path and the changes beginning, so he has to use it regularly. So it's not a cure, it's more like a treatment, sort of preventative almost, that regular use is needed to stave off the changes. It does appear to be rare and expensive, that in order to get, 40 vials that he wanted, he had to trade an entire human for organ harvesting, which, just like in the black market in the real world, organs are potentially worth quite a lot of money. So it's obviously something that's quite rare and quite expensive. I don't want to get too into the supposed retcon with that, because in terms of the actual sort of timeline of Fallout, there's several years between the end of Fallout 4 and the TV show, and it's been 15 years since, 15 years since we were actually in the West Coast side from New Vegas to the TV show. That is plenty of time for somebody to invent a new drug. So just to be clear, it could be that this is something relatively new that somebody has developed since the games, and that's why it didn't exist in the games, because maybe it didn't exist at that time, but since then somebody in that part of the world has invented it. So just put that out there, but that's the thing about that. And one of the questions I think as well is, why is it only some people actually change and become ghouls? And nobody really seems to know for sure, but it seems likely that there's a specific mutation after exposure to ionising radiation that affects the function of the neurotransmitters in the spinal cord that are responsible for your autonomic nervous system, so your cardiac function, your respiratory function. It's all managed by the brainstem and that part of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. So that seems the most likely, potential reason, and it might be that it's the mutations in a specific gene that not everybody carries, and that's why some people become ghouls and some people don't. So there's some interesting terminal entries from the Chop Shop, which is the clinic in the ghoul city of Underworld, which is in the Museum of History in Fallout 3. The terminal entries don't actually appear in the game because of a bug, so you can see the titles of the entries, but you can't actually read the text. They don't show up. It's a bug, but we have got them from the game files and we'll go through them just shortly. But it seems that Dr. Barrows, who runs that clinic, has been putting a lot of work into this. So the first entry says, examination of the post-necrotic human. In my 7 dozen years of studying the ghoul anatomy, I discover more and more evidence to support my theory on the nature of the not radiological human, or ghoul as they're commonly called. In summary, I theorise that our unnaturally long lifespan is due to a mutation within the autonomic nervous system of certain individuals following exposure to specific combinations of ionising radiation with wavelengths below 10 picometers. This mutation, it seems, disrupts the normal process of decay in the neurotransmitters along the spinal cord. Specifically, the transmitters affected are those responsible for cardiac and respiratory function in a healthy human. According to my studies, these transmitters are continually regenerated after mutation, carrying sufficient oxygen to sustain the life of the subject while being insufficient to retain skin elasticity and avoid necrosis, the result of which is the corpse-like appearance of post-mutation humans. It should be noted that exposure to radiation typically results in sickness, followed by death. I think there's supposed to be a will in there somewhere. Anyway, followed by death, and the X factor that will lead to mutation upon exposure in lieu of the typical outcome remains unknown to this researcher. in the coming months I will be assembling my findings on this subject into a full study. So that's quite an interesting one. So this is Dr. Barrow's theory, and he's spent 7 dozen years, that's what, 96, if I remember my 7 times table, that he's been studying ghouls, their anatomy, their physiology and things, so kind of knows what he's talking about, and he's also living that himself. And then the other ones will be a wee bit more relevant next week. But the brain structure of a luminous necrotic post-human, colloquially referred to as a glowing one, indicates that the regenerative ability of the neurological systems that affords typical necrotic post-humans their longevity does not extend into the higher reasoning functions of the brain itself. This subject is further covered in report on the dissection of feral necrotic post-humans. So the distinctive luminescence that is the trademark of the glowing one can be best attributed to an unusual amount of radioactive chemicals that building up in the bloodstream and muscle tissue of a typical ghoul. Upon the transformation into a feral ghoul, the neurological systems of the body cease filtering these particles from the blood and tissue, instead causing them to build a distinctive bioluminescence that is distinctive of the glowing ones. Their social structure seems to be different from that of the feral ghoul. They actively seek out others of both their strain and those afflicted with ferocious post-necrotic dystrophy. Try saying that 5 times fast. Particularly those who may have been injured. Studies on the nature of their healing effects on other ghouls continues with no conclusive results as of yet. So that's him talking about the glowing ones, obviously, and how their bodies seem to build up this radioactive chemicals in the bloodstream, and that's what leads them to start glowing, which is obviously what bioluminescence means. And their kind of ability to heal other ghouls, so we know that can happen where a glowing one can release a burst of radiation and the ghouls that were dead get brought back to life to fight again. So interesting little aside there, and we will get into the glowing ones a bit more next week. The final entry is a study of ferocious post-necrotic dystrophy. So this is the term that he has given to feral ghouls. So the brain structure of a feral necrotic post-human indicates that the regenerative ability of the neurological systems that affords typical necrotic post-humans their longevity does not extend into the higher reasoning functions of the brain itself. This is a condition that I refer to as ferocious post-necrotic dystrophy. So dystrophy is a medical term that means sort of wasting or degeneration. So like muscular dystrophy is where the muscles waste away, and that's what's kind of being described here in terms of the brain and the feral ghouls. So then he goes on to say, as the reasoning and high-order thinking portions of the brain deteriorate, the post-human subject becomes increasingly hostile, giving in to a carnal need to feed as opposed to the capacity for thinking that a typical necrotic post-human retains. It remains unclear exactly what precipitates this change in biology and psychology, but anecdotal evidence seems to indicate that non-social ghouls or those in isolation are more prone to the condition. So I say these terminal entries are really, really interesting, and it is kind of a shame that, they kind of exist in the game, but they don't, because they don't show up in normal gameplay. Maybe somebody's made a mod to restore them. I know that's something that, modders do, is restore missing content or sometimes cut content that's still hidden in the game files and things, but you can find this on the wiki, but I'll put the text on the screen for you guys as well so that you can kind of see them for yourself. But as a rule, the thing to remember is that most people that are exposed to that level of radiation are going to die of acute radiation sickness, or in some cases something a bit slower, but radiation is going to kill the majority of people, and that is what happened. The ghouls are kind of a small number in terms of the number of people that were actually killed in the Great War, but those that have become ghouls, they're functionally immortal. They can be killed, obviously, but not always that easy, because they can survive losing limbs. So you do have to shoot them in the head, which I know is something that certain ghouls really, really dislike. They really don't like that comparison to zombies from fiction. Understandable, because it's not a very nice thing to say, especially to these ghouls that are fully functional. You know, they're not feral, they're still people, essentially. So the majority of ghouls that you do encounter were born before the bombs, but there are some that have been created after the bombs, such as Hancock, who used a drug. We'll talk about him more. Moira Brown, if you do detonate the bomb in Megaton, she becomes a ghoul. So it can happen after that. There's a bunch of them in Camp Searchlight in Fallout New Vegas because the Legion let off the dirty bomb, turned a lot of the NCR soldiers into feral ghouls, and then one that wasn't. So it is something that can happen since, but the majority of ghouls that you do encounter were born before the bombs fell. Would you choose to become a ghoul? Is that something that you'd want? I mean, it's obviously a potential option for becoming immortal and living forever, but living life as a ghoul, it's not easy in the wasteland. For starters, the non-feral ghouls do face an awful lot of discrimination from humans, which they do sometimes give back. They obviously use the term smooth skin, but they do face a lot of discrimination, like they all get kicked out of Diamond City. The ghouls at the Slog are another one that, you know, they couldn't really find work or find a settlement that was willing to allow them to live there, so they just kind of went out on their own. And you do see it, you know, Tenpenny Tower in Fallout 3 is another one where the ghouls want to live in the tower. They've got the money, so they've met the financial requirement to live in the tower, but they're still not allowed in because nobody wants them there. It is something that they kind of deal with all across the wasteland. So, you know, making a choice to become something that means that people are going to discriminate against you, it's not an easy decision to make, and I think that applies as much in real life as it does in the game. That, you know, there's that issue of kind of discrimination. People are obviously worried about ghouls going feral, which is not unfounded because it does happen, and it does seem to be that is the eventual fate of most ghouls. Because even the anti-ghoul serum, the vials from the TV show, they're not a fix. It's not a one dose, bam, there you go, you're never going to turn feral. It's something that has to be taken regularly or the feralization process will continue. So, you know, you've got that. And their appearance as well, which realistically it's not very attractive, as much as they can have very nice personalities. And I do love Hancock, I think he's brilliant. I'd like the fact that he is a romance option in Fallout 4 because why not? But on the whole, they're, you know, they do look like walking corpses, so you can understand that people probably do find that a wee bit off-putting, even if that's not really a justifiable way of reason to discriminate against someone. But, you know, humans will human. But I think that the non-feral ghouls can add a lot of value to society in this post-war world, because these people have had 2 centuries to potentially dedicate to learning, to studying, to inventing things, and we know some of them that do. Dr. Barrow's here as an example. He's studying ghouls, he's studying their physiology, he's studying their anatomy and trying to learn everything about how they work. Keely in New Vegas that you find in Vault 22, she's obviously a scientist, and she's had a lot longer than most scientists have to learn and study things, so you've got to assume that she's pretty smart and has quite a vast amount of knowledge because she's had a lot more time to learn things than most people do. So that gives them potential value, that they can contribute something really useful to society, and especially when we are talking about rebuilding society and trying to make the world better. So I think that's quite an interesting aspect to the ghouls, but it's maybe not the most attractive option for living forever if there's a better way that you could do it. But it is potentially an option. And I think it's interesting to look at some of the unique versions that come under the ghoul category. So the glowing ones, which we mentioned briefly, getting into them a lot more, because they do tend to fall into kind of leadership roles in groups of feral ghouls, which I think is really, really interesting. And you do encounter a couple of glowing ones that have retained their neurological functions and they're not feral, which I think is really cool. You've got Harold, who's shown up in Fallout 1, Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, who is slowly becoming a tree. He's technically a ghoul, at least he starts out looking like a ghoul. You've got the marked men of the Divide, who are really interesting because they're also a form of ghoul. There's quite a few different variations that I think it's worth talking about. So that's going to be for next week. That's going to be me for today. Hopefully you found this interesting, and I think any thoughts about ghouls, about what it would be like to be a ghoul? Would that be something that you would choose if you had the option? Or would you really rather not go through life being discriminated against and called a zombie? Let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.